Okay, let's start. Can you all hear my voice and see the PPT?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, we
perfect.
can see.
Perfect. Perfect. So, okay. So, we are doing MDI 9, and I've combined Unit 1 and 2 to get a better sense of what we are talking in terms of human trafficking and its types. This becomes a very interesting unit. In fact, it becomes a very interesting subject because it is so much multifaceted. Let's quickly jump into it. As I said, the rules remain the same. You can stop me at any moment of time to ask or to add any new information that you share. Objectives, significance, and interpretations of trafficking, between trafficking, migration, and smuggling, and describe various types of trafficking. So let's start with the definition: exchange and exploitation of individuals for financial gains. UN Trafficking Persons Protocols legally defines act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving a person through methods such as force, coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception to exploit them. What has changed since the earliest form of trafficking to today? Internet being a predominantly communication medium, is now new forms of trafficking are happening. More often than not, new forms of recruiting. You do not need transportation, uh, and you can still force coerce a person through fraud, deception, and before a person realizes it, the person is a part of the trafficking ring. So we shall see how it works. So quickly, difference between migration, smuggling, and trafficking. Migration refers to movement of people from one place to another, typically to seek better living conditions. Now, this better is a very subjective, relative term. A lot of times, this better is more perceived rather than real. However, better is always, every human being desires better in terms of living, employment, or to escape conflict, persecution, or natural disasters. All of us are trying to do better. It could be in an abstract fashion in terms of being perceived better or actually being better. Migration can be voluntary or forced, encompasses a wide range of movements and reasons, which we know. Trafficking, as I just told you, is recruitment, transportation, transferring by improper means for unlawful purpose of profit. There is always a profit motive in trafficking. Smuggling specifically involves the illegal facilitation of migrants' entry or residence in another country for financial or material gain. Now, another thing that we talked about in the earlier unit in MDI 7, we talked about the fact whenever countries try and stop people, especially because of the fact movement has been the story of human being since the dawn of civilization, since the evolution of human beings. Migration and movement are two basic essentials. Whenever nation states try and stop this movement, people will utilize illegal means, and this illegal means is the way smuggling happens. People are pushed into another country without valid documents by smugglers who take money for putting people in an illegal country. Now, the difference between trafficking and smuggling is the fact smuggling is just a conduit. So it is to put a person in another country. There is and the transaction finishes after that has been done. Smuggling can lead to trafficking is a separate thing, but trafficking is purely for exploiting a human being for profit. Smuggling is just taking money and putting the human being in an illegal way in another country. Uh, uh, so, so trafficking and migration. Now, in the ideal sense, trafficking and migration and smuggling are all three movements, Sanjeev. All involve movement.
Sir.
Migration is historically people trying to move for better.
Yes.
Now, in trafficking, they have not been moved for better, but for worse, because now they are being exploited for somebody else's profit. Smuggling is, on the other hand, moving illegally for better, but may or may not be exploited at the end. The transaction can end just by the movement. Sanjeev?
Okay, sir.
Got it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Smuggling is what we do, smuggling of drugs, smuggling of items. You are moving something illegally. And here it is humans. Okay. Sanjeev?
Sir.
Got it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Article 3 of United Nations Protocols against smuggling of migrants by land sea refers to the act of facilitating the illegal entry of person into a state where the person is not a citizen or a permanent member. Yes, Shreya, financial gain is involved in both smuggling and trafficking. Because at the end of the day, the smuggler is taking money to put a person illegally in another country. In terms of trafficking, it is not a one-time transaction. The person is first put illegally in another country and then exploited for financial gain by the trafficker. Shreya?
Okay, sir.
Okay. Trafficking is exploited.
Sir,
Yeah, Sanjeev.
Sir, what if I term that like after migration also trafficking may happen?
Correct. See, now what is happening is, I'll just come to the next slide.
Yeah, okay.
So inevitably people are always migrating. Now the fact is, when they are migrating and the countries where and there are specific ways people migrate. So for example, people can migrate over land, let's say between India and Bangladesh, or India and Nepal, or closest country, or they can migrate by if you have to migrate to, let's say, UK, you cannot go by train. There is no train. So either you will go by ship or you will go by air. So there are specific migratory routes. Now, inevitably, if countries put in barriers to migration, then more often than not, people will take dangerous routes for migration, where there is a chance for them to fall prey to traffickers. Sanjeev?
Yes, sir.
Yes, it is something like this.
Yes.
I want to go from Delhi to Assam. If there are not enough means of transportation, I might decide to drive without knowing the routes, and then I might fall prey to highway robbers.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so
sir.
It's all about, so trafficking is exploitation based, while smuggling is transportation based. Smuggling is basically transportation, illegally putting out there, whereas trafficking is exploitation, and migration is movement from one place to another for better life. Okay. Okay. Trafficking is recognized human right violation and a public health and a global development issue. And that is why it has come in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery. And if you notice, all three have been put together: trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery, because at the end of the day, trafficking is forced labor and it's like modern slavery. And if you remember, when we were doing MDI 8, the unit 1, we were talking about how historically slavery has been a part of humankind. So more often than not, the forms and the types change, but the way human beings operate remains the same in different ways. So that is trafficking. Is fueled by high reward and low risk dynamics. which means that trafficker can expect to make a lot of money with minimal fear of punishment or legal consequence. Because more often than not, most of us neither know or understand or know the basic signs whether a person has been trafficked. For example, when we come across on the road a beggar, we have no idea whether the beggar has been forced to beg or the beggar is begging out of his own free volition. Everything is complex, and unless people are sensitized, unless politicians are sensitized, unless healthcare professionals are sensitized, we will never be able to understand what is of free will and what is forced. So while drug sale is completed in one transaction, human sale is process which can be done over and over again. So more often than not, if a person is trafficked, then the trafficker can, abuse the person, take forced labor, then sell it to another trafficker who will do the same and sell it to another and another. It's a multiple sale transaction. ILO estimates profit from human trafficking and forced labor are to the tune of 150 billion annually. And I do not know which year has that figure been calculated. It could be many times higher than this. So you can imagine how many people are stuck into the trafficking game. And as we go through this MDI 9, we'll figure out why is it so difficult. In both MDI 9 and 10, you will see why is it so difficult to identify traffickers, to prosecute traffickers, why trafficking is still a very lucrative business. So various types of trafficking. Sexual exploitation is the most common understood by most people. But then there is forced labor, there is something called debt bondage, there is domestic servitude, organ removal, forced begging, child soldiers, forced marriage. These are just few of the types. As we'll go, we will see various other forms, but these are the major subtypes of trafficking. And again, as I said, most public or most of us are acutely aware of the sexual exploitation part of trafficking, but the rest, most of us are not aware or sensitized or understand the other types of trafficking. So these are some of the major types. That while vast majority of trafficking cases identified in early 21st century were of sexual exploitation, past decade has seen a shift according to UNODC. And as we go through this, this course, you will realize why it is shifting. With many experts arguing that labor trafficking may actually be more prevalent than trafficking for sex, but comparatively undetected. Because it is something like this, you see labor working next door on a construction site, you do not know whether they are forced to work or they are working out of their fee violation. You will never be able to figure out. In 2022 UNODC global report also highlighted another aspect of trafficking under the heading social suffering of trafficked men. An increasing number of male trafficked victims are being detected since 2003, with their share being 20% of the detected. Men are disproportionately underreported. For example, why they are underreported is the fact that if a male trafficked victim is found, more often than not, the male would be very hesitant to report the fact that he has been, he has been trafficked out of deceit. Male ego will not allow them to acknowledge the fact that they have gone through a fraud or deceit. Women are much more easy to acknowledge the fact that they have been deceived. Men do not. For example, men are trafficked for sexual exploitation. No man will, kind of accept that he has been sexually exploited. There are enough cases of men's sexual exploitation, children's sexual exploitation. Trafficking for removal of organs, 0.2%. Trafficking for illegal adoption, 0.2%. Exploitative begging, 0.7%. Forced marriage, 0.9%. Criminal activity, trafficking for forced criminal activity, 10.2%. Trafficking for sexual exploitation, 38.7%. For forced labor, 38.8%. And these are the detected victims. Please understand, to detect a victim itself requires a special kind of training, understanding, and seeing and understanding signs of trafficking or exploitation. Then to be able to get those victims to accept that they have been exploited, then try and rehabilitate them. It's a very lengthy. And remember, most of these victims are cross border, means they are in an alien culture, not speaking a language, scared, they are coerced, and then trying and rescuing them. Okay, so let's look at the types. Sexual exploitation: use of fraud, force, or coercion to compel individuals to engage in commercial sex acts. Subcategory of human trafficking: exploitation of people in commercial sex, where victims are expected to provide commercial sex on demand without any meaningful right to refuse. Exploitation is that of rape and of abrogation of individual autonomy. So there is this debate about whether women which provide commercial sex are there by their choice or are being forced. More often than not, they are forced. It's a deceit, it's a coercion, and there are many modus operandi to get to lure such victims in this trade. And it's basically stems from vulnerabilities. All people are vulnerable in some way or the other, but there are special categories of people who become vulnerable. For example, poverty, for example, natural disasters, for example, wars. For example, there are so many ways people become vulnerable, and traffickers are these criminals who look at where people are vulnerable and then exploit that vulnerability. For example, migration is also a vulnerability where people have to move. And suppose this person who's migrating is, for example, illiterate, or for example, has not seen or known where he or she is going, there is obviously a chance of these criminals exploiting. Are often deceived or coerced into believing they are entering legitimate work only to find themselves trapped in the sex industry. For example, recently there have been a lot of news items about fake call centers being busted in the NCR region. Now, more often than not, most of the youngsters who have been caught in these fake call centers would have thought they are entering a legitimate call center. They might have been deceived into believing that they're doing a legitimate call center work. Sexual exploitation can take various forms, including prostitution, pornography, strip clubs, escort services, and now online sexual exploitation. In fact, with internet, sexual exploitation has taken on a whole different dimension. Vulnerable youngsters are entrapped and then made to perform online sexual services. Even though women and children most commonly found victims, men and boys are too trafficked for sex. do not come forward due to social and cultural stigmas in most communities. Then, of course, LGBTQ plus individuals, especially transgender, found to be victims of sexual exploitation with accurate numbers hard to find. Again, remember, how do you find whether a person has been exploited, has been trafficked, unless you are trained to read signals, trained to find such people? You will never. For example, as I told you earlier, you are driving, you come across a beggar child. How do you know that the beggar child is a trafficked person, has been forced to beg, or you know has been doing out of his own free will? There is little focused research on LGBTQ trafficked community for sexual exploitation. Again, resources, biases, and all kinds of things. Subcategory is child sexual abuse, encompasses a wide range of sexual act enacted on people below 18 years of age. Impossible to put a number on how many children are being commercially sexually exploited. No system in place to track it, and depending on how they are identified by authorities, are labeled as juvenile delinquents, child welfare cases, or runaway case. For example, in a lot of cases for men, they are identified, labeled it as different. So you will never get to know the real number in terms of trafficking. For example, the concept of bonded labor still exists in India. There are people, families who are doing bonded labor. So let's look at the second category, forced labor. Person mentions that there is a statistical bias in reporting forced labor because of the high visibility of sexual exploitation. As I said, most of us are sensitized to sexual exploitation. There's a growing concern that this type is less frequently detected. And in fact, worldwide, there are many industries which are working on forced labor. And we shall see in MDI 9 why human trafficking just does not stop, in fact, keeps increasing. Reasons for bias. Most countries included criminalization of traffic for forced labor as late as 2005. Cases of trafficking for forced labor detected, often recorded under different charge. So the police person or the law enforcement person who comes across a female, a woman in a sexual trafficking, let's say in a red light area, can put that female for illicit, or for prostitution, but will not put it under trafficking because the law enforcement person himself does not know about trafficking or any laws about trafficking. And then, in the absence of any coordination between different agencies, or for the fact he's bribed off. Visibility bias with victims of forced labor working in hidden locations, for example, agriculture field in rural areas, mining camps, and garment factories. For example, the whole Thai fishing industry is filled with trafficking victims, because most of the people who are working in the fishing industry are at high seas, which is international waters, do not come under any jurisdiction, country's jurisdiction, composed of a lot of trafficking victims. Now, at this moment, a question will enter into your head: why can't these people come out and seek help? We shall see as we go along why it is very difficult to seek help. Detected victims for the purpose of forced labor by industrial exploitation. So look at the industrial exploitation. Fishing, domestic work, cleaning services, street selling, construction work. Agriculture and farming being the largest, 29%. Fishing being next, 28%. Why? Because agriculture work is in rural areas, far out areas, farms, Nobody bothers. There is no law enforcement. Fishing, because it's international waters, there is no country's jurisdiction. Nobody bothers. Well, in fact, in domestic work also, your next door, person who's working next door, how would you know whether the person is actually doing, paid work or forced labor? We've come across so many news items where we have seen educated, well-off people beating children, abusing them. A lot of these people are trafficked. Now, under forced labor, there is a category called debt bondage. Peonage, debt slavery, or bonded labor as a type of forced labor involving a debt that must be paid off through the work with ILO estimating about one-fifth of the. So what happens? So there is this vulnerable family in a rural area who has taken a loan for, either illness in the family or a marriage, and the money lender says that now this loan can be repaid off if your son, your young son is able to work and pay off the loan. Now this son is taken from the family, put as a domestic servant, and because this family is vulnerable, illiterate, does not know what interest is being charged, the money lender perpetually keeps hiking up the money that is owed, and the child remains perpetually in debt, and the family remains perpetually in debt. Similarly, if, let's say, a migrant wants to be smuggled into another country and does not have the money for the smuggler says, okay, I will take you to that other country, and then you will have to work for some time to pay me off. And the guy and the person, the man or the woman who is smuggled gets into debt of the smuggler, and it is, forced labor is taken off the person in terms of debt bondage. So a lot of beggary, criminal enterprise is out of debt bondage, that you owe this debt, now you do this. Most prevalent form of human slavery in all regions of the world. No authoritative estimate of the people enslaved in, I estimate about 21 million people. This is just an estimation. Pushing people and families into this formula, including structural and systematic inequalities, poverty, discrimination, precarious labor migration, weak or non-existent financial and other regulatory frameworks. So there's an illness in the family, debt is taken. And now, the person giving the debt can put the family in debt bondage. In fact, all these latest news items about these women from Punjab who were trafficked to the Middle Age, most of them wanted to better their life, got into debt bondage. Domestic servitude, form of slavery, traps people into forced labor within private homes. They may be ill-treated and made to work for little or no pay. Remember that Indian diplomat in the US who, or the Hindujas who had this domestics which they won't pay, and force them to do labor. Becomes a trafficked one when the employer uses force, fraud, or coercion to maintain control over the worker, to make a worker believe that he has no choice. The Hindujas case was typically like that, where they would not pay the employee. And we come across these cases in every city. On a periodic ways, this news breaks out that this educated, high-flying, professional, middle class people forcing their boy servant or girl servant or other servant. Particularly vulnerable to exploitation due to exclusion from laws governing overtime, safe and health working environment, workplace discrimination, and right to organize. So domestic servitude becomes particularly vulnerable because nobody is going to pry into people's homes. And there are not too many laws doing that. Other types of exploitation: forced criminal activity, shoplifting, pickpocketing, theft of cars, petrol, jewelry, trafficking of begging, trafficking for adoption, forced marriage, organ trafficking, child soldiers. Forced marriage is supposed to be. There was this news item recently from Bihar where this guy got a government job. He was abducted and forcefully married to this particular girl. So these are some of the other types of exploitation. Various stages of trafficking: pre-departure states, earlier phase. Remember, in trafficking, there is the victim is first identified based on vulnerabilities. These are all criminal gangs which involve men, which involve women. Those victims are then lured with fraud, with deception, with force. Victim become involved in the traffic. So some of the circumstances that may detrimental impacts on an individual physical and psychological trait. In the rural areas, there are a lot of children who run away from homes because of fight with the parents, because of various reasons. Missing children are still a major issue in the country. In fact, remember, some time back there were these major cases of lynching where people had been lynched because they were thought to be child lifters. Well, besides the lynching part, the point is missing children are a major case. Children go missing because they are lured. For example, a lot of children in the rural areas run away, come to the cities, then get entrapped into debt bondage with this, trafficking agents. Poverty, unemployment, political instability leads to a lot of, people becoming vulnerable. Travel and transit phase, victim consents or coerced into leaving, accompanied by a trafficker. So, for example, a child has fought with the parents, comes to this neighborhood auntie or uncle who is very sympathetic, and I shall, your parents are not good, and let me show you a better life. When individual reaches their destination phase, encompasses transportation between work location, frequent entails many transit terminals. So a lot of women from, let's say, Nepal, abject poverty, are trafficked, taken via India into Southeast Asia. Calcutta being the transit point. May experience several instances of travel and transit, such as being transferred from one place to another, hazardous means of transportation, risky border crossings. We've seen, again, news items of a lot of boats getting capsized in the Mediterranean Sea, where people, those are, many of those are smuggling cases, but there are cases of trafficking also. We read this news item of a Gujarati family who froze to death between the Canadian American border. They were illegally trying to cross. So obviously smuggling was involved there. Potential to result in harms, fatalities, including serious psychological strain. All those people who, Indians who were chained and deported back to India, think of the psychological strain they would have to undergo. They first went to US illegally, and of course today the US government has gone totally batty in terms of immigration and going against immigrants, but the whole process of chaining them and bringing them back was, contravening to all international laws. And the worst part was that the Indian government also did not object to this happening because it's a human right issue. Final stage, when victims become aware of their debts and the repayment responsibility, being trapped in a state of debt bondage, compelled to work, unfamiliar surroundings, do not speak language, believe they have no legal rights, feel physically and psychologically isolated. And once the person becomes physically and psychologically isolated, the trafficker has done his job, his or her job. The victims are also made to believe that if they go and take help, say, for example, there is a person who's trafficked to the US in forced labor. Now, the fact is, if this person who has entered illegally doing forced labor goes to the authorities, A, he's an illegal migrant. So the considering today's political environment in today's government, that person will take the person and deport or put him in detention. So the person will not go out and seek help. And in fact, the trafficker will make the victim believe that if they go out and seek help, they will be put in prison. When we look at the evolution, as I said in MBI 8, I was talking about by changes in social, legal, and cultural understanding of human rights, labor migration, and exploitation. Existed for millennia, societies across the world, ancient Greek, Rome, Egypt, engaged in the practice of capturing, selling, and exploiting human beings. So human beings have always been like this, enslaved through war, conquest, or debt. Transatlantic slaves, we talked about 16th to 19th century, large-scale human trafficking, almost 12 to 14 to 15 million people were slaved and transported. Exploitations of Africans, abolition movement, 19th century, transatlantic slave began to be abolished in various countries. Need for cheap labor came in the indentured forms, forced labor and trafficking of individuals for the personal domestic servitude and prostitution. So look at the fact, Qatar holds the World Cup. For holding the World Cup, they need to construct stadiums. For constructing stadiums, Qatar does not have local labor to construct those stadiums. They get labor from India, Nepal, and all these South Asian countries. Now, these are single men who travel to Qatar for construction, and the construction is not a 1 day, 1 month, or a 2 month affair. This is long. These men are single men. They have no form of entertainment. They are lonely. The families are not there. What are the intended consequences? They would be the rise of prostitution. That prostitution will happen by trafficked women, because think of the fact, no women, it's not a profession women enjoy. They are forced, they are put into debt bondage, trafficked. Once that is there, there are other forms of things which happen, drugs come in and so on. So every action has its intended and unintended consequences. End of 19th century, white slave trade. Traffic of women for sexual exploitation, often referred to as white slave trade, became more prominent in Europe and US. Now, there was a certain amount of politics in also this. This led to the first international agreement aimed at combating the form of trafficking. But remember, at that time, women were trying to have sexual freedom as well as wanting to move. So this was also having a political angle to try and subjugate the white woman. Indentured, see, Sanjeev, point is, indentured was a contract form of labor, where there was a contract between the owner and the labor. However, remember, the labor was illiterate, was vulnerable. There were various issues. So a person actually goes for a contract, but there is a deceit involved. So,
Yes.
in a way, it was an indirect form of bonded labor or slavery or uh, trafficking, you can say.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes,
Why
sir.
Domingo says, why despite high levels of technology advancement, information and advanced border control technique, okay. So understand one thing, Domingos, human beings, at the end of the day, all technology, all processes, all legality is run by human beings. Human beings are subjective people. So for example, a border guard who is not paid enough in the system finds a way to make a quick buck by allowing people to be smuggled in. Remember, the business of smuggling and trafficking is a very high profitable business with low risk. And smuggling can only happen if all the elements in the process are part of the smuggling ring. Domingos?
Yes, sir, got it.
So at the end of the day, there are people involved, and people have various motivations. Remember, one would say everybody knows about smoking, it causes cancer. Why are people still smoking? Because inevitably, there are some people who are weak, who needs substance to propel themselves. It is also cool to smoke. Then there are these tobacco companies which want to push their product. So there are various ways why things keep on happening.
Okay, got it.
Okay. So in fact, here in this white slave, the notion of this white slave trade, the various countries started bringing in some laws. 1904 to 10 international agreement for suppression of white slave trade was one of the first international recognized the need for cross-border efforts to prevent trafficking of women for prostitution. But there was also, as I said, a political angle to it. The idea to control the women force, the idea to control the white women. Then there was the League of Nations and post-World War I, addressed human trafficking, emphasized the protection of women and children. International treaties were still limited in scope and effectiveness. Again, remember, the law is just one part. How is that law interpreted? How is the law executed? And what happens? So suppose the law says that prostitution is unlawful. Now the law enforcement person comes across a prostitute. What does the law enforcement person do? The law enforcement person, like let's say a police person, understands the law in terms of prostitution being illegal. But what does the person do? What is the next step? In the absence of any step, what the person does is, okay, fine, take the person who's prostituting out of the system, take some money, say, oh, go lead your life, and that person goes back into prostitution. So we need to understand law is not enough, technology is not enough. There has to be many more ways when to stop this. But then we will also see how over a period of time with capitalization there was an element of demand which comes in. For example, when the Qatar stadiums were made and there were these single South Asian men without families living out in cramped quarters, there was a demand for sex, a demand for cheap sex. That demand for cheap sex could only be satisfied with women who had been trafficked and would offer services at a very low cost. So an element of demand comes in. We'll read about demand in the first subsequent units. Post World War II remain a significant issues. Focus somewhere after World War II, focus to the protection of refugees and displaced persons. And then there are so many things which need attention of communities, of nations. And then remember, there is the politics of it. So think about the politics of it. US does not have enough labor to work its economy. So the whole economy works on immigrants. And yet the US today goes after immigrants. The identity politics. The Convention for Suppression of Trafficking, 49 Convention for Suppression of Trafficking in Person, Exploitation of Prostitution, mark more universal commitment. And simultaneously, remember, there are other engines which are at work. There are organizations, NGOs, transnational organizations which try and work towards betterment. 70s to 80s, human trafficking become to be understood in broader terms, no longer about prostitution, exploitation of people, various forms of forced labor, including agriculture work, domestic labor, and manufacturing. For example, there was a concerted effort against bonded labor in India. Swami Agnivesh, he's no longer, he passed away some time back, did a major amount of work in bonded labor. Bonded labor was found in brick kilns all around NCR. All these families were in debt bondage and they were made to work in brick kilns. 1990s, rise of human rights discourse. Trafficking was increasingly framed within the context of human rights and victim protection. End of Cold War and subsequent surge in global migration and organized crime networks also contributed. So, it is almost like humanity goes 3 steps forward and then goes 4 steps behind. 1 step forward, 2 steps behind. And this is a continuous effort which works. So all these detentions, deportations, fight against immigrants, do you think smuggling will stop? No. Do you think illegal entries will stop? No. Do you think human trafficking will stop? No. New forms will arise because remember, there are human beings involved. 2000 UN protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, was adopted, often referred to as Palermo Protocol. We will read about this Palermo Protocol many times in MDI 9 and 10. In fact, most of the times we'll talk about Palermo Protocol. It was the first, the baseline through which, after which laws were made. Marked a significant shift in international law defining human trafficking, emphasizing both victim protection and the need for criminal justice measures. So now you pick up Indian newspapers and see how much media space is devoted on trafficking. In fact, you'll be shocked to know the kind of trafficking which is happening in India and the media which is talking about it. There's just no talk about it. There was US, put out this law, the US Trafficking Victim Protection Act, TVP, at 2000, which also became kind of a pole star for victim protection. Trafficking Victim Protection Act, TVPA, created federal laws against human trafficking, assistance to victims, required use specific actions to combat trafficking. Model for other countries in crafting anti-trafficking legislations. So as I said, crafting a legislation is just the first step. There are many more steps after that in terms of sensitization, in terms of enforcement, in terms of victim protection, in terms of rehabilitation, and so on and so forth. Awareness campaigns and advocacy. There was advocacy groups like Polaris Project, Anti-Slavery International, Not for Sale. So there are all these international organizations. In India, there are a lot of organizations which work against, against trafficking. There are organizations which work in Bengal, in Assam, in Delhi. Media has played a role in exposing hidden nature of trafficking network with films, documentary, high-profile events. So all these things added to the fight against trafficking. So let's look at the global trafficking scenario quickly. Third largest criminal industry, flooring drugs and arms trafficking, transnational organized crime. UNODC reports that trafficking is prevalent in 155 countries out of 168 or 170, whatever. Means that it's not only a violation of individual countries' laws, but also international human rights case. Leave more people vulnerable to, and now with climate change happening and various local wars, more and more people become vulnerable to trafficking. The 2024 report talks about 25% increase in the number of trafficking detected globally in 22 compared to 2019. This is detected. What is actually happening, we do not know. Between 19 and 22, global nature of victim detected for trafficking for forced labor surged by 47%. Again, why? Because of the demand for cheap products, cheaper agriculture goods, cheaper products. Obviously, you can't have people working for cheap unless you are forcing them to work for cheap. Global number of detected child victims increased 31%. Wars happening in multiple countries, civil wars happening, climate change. So now, for example, there was this earthquake in Myanmar and Thailand. So many families would have got destroyed. What happens to those children? A lot of these children may get into these traffic networks. More boy victims have been detected. Increasing number of unaccompanied and separated children have been recorded. In high-income countries, often involving girls trafficked for sexual exploitation. Thank God. What's that? Why absolutely, information is not easy to get. What are the efforts taken from the UN and such organization to act human? So again, the fact is, listen, UN is a global organization which can only advise countries to make individual laws. So, for example, India will follow the Palermo Protocol to make its own law. Now the fact is, when Indian government makes a law, how is that law implemented with various states, various areas? Uh, and then once a parliament law comes down to the ground level, who is understanding, sensitized, implementing, aiding, rehabilitating? How is the process? So unless the process is not defined, all these laws fall flat. So, for example, I'll give you an example. So there's a very strict law against dowry in India. Whereas, where if the female complains against the boy or the parents that that person has taken dowry and harassed the female, without any questions asked, the boy and the parents are put in jail. Now, there are cases where women have taken advantage of this law and undue and unjustly put the boy and the parents in jail where there was not even a question of dowry or harassment. Now, how do you handle this? So there is a pushback to say they talk about men's rights. There have been so many men who have been unjustly harassed, or their parents who have been unjustly harassed. Now, laws have also to be continuously changed or tweaked or moved. And then people who are implementing those laws have to be sensitized to the situation. But at the end of the day, there are people, these people have motivations, money is a major motivation, and so on and so forth. Vinod?
Sure, sir. Thank you.
So inevitably, as I said, anything needs multiple stakeholders to address that issue, effectively. And inevitably, there are so many issues, so many stakeholders. Human trafficking also involves multiple countries with multiple laws, multiple stakeholders. So inevitably, things fall between stools, and that's why it continues to be there and carry on. And then how information is shared, how people are sensitized. As I said, pick up the Indian media for a week or a month and see how much information about trafficking is given. Is any information given at all? What are the sensitization ways? Because it's not that trafficking is not happening, it's not that crime is not happening, but how are we addressing? How are non-government organizations brought in? How are civil society and remember, governments cannot do anything because governments are short-staffed. They have limitation in terms of money. They have many things to do, and that's why civil society engagement becomes important. Non-government organizations become important, and then once you get into this identity politics, then things become more complicated. Women and girls continue to account for majority of victims detected worldwide, which we talked about could be because of a bias. Sexual is something which is biased, which most people understand. So 45% of the detected boys are trafficked for forced labor, 47 for other purposes, including forced criminality and begging. Trafficking for forced criminality include online scams. Today, online scams are done by these people who are forced into doing it. Ranks third in the number of victims detected and gone up from accounting. And because online makes a crime anonymous and virtual, to detect is one, to prosecute is second, to shut down and prosecute is second and third. And then it can be done from any place. So if a crime is being done in India or a crime is done in US from India, how do you galvanize the Indian government or the Indian law enforcement into shutting down that crime? It becomes quite a complex thing. Special chapter on Africa region has been neglected due to difficulties in obtaining data. At the end of the day, you can only manage something if you can measure it. If there is no way to measure it, how do you know? So unless there are, and that is where research, that is where data collection, that is where data becomes a very important part. And in a lot of places, you will find that data is not just being collected. Detected African victim account for the highest number of destinations reached in all, total 162 different nationalities. Again, because of poverty, because of various other reasons. Cross-border flows detected, 31% involve citizens of African countries. And with world focus on various things, obviously, then prioritization happens. Most African victims trafficked within the continent, displacement, insecurity, and climate change are exacerbating vulnerabilities more frequently detected than adult. Africa has a lot of cases of child army, child fighters, child warriors. Latin America, child, wherever there is civil conflicts, you will have child warriors. Child victims detected is the overall increase in the number of cases detected in sub-Saharan Africa. So unless and another thing, the world needs to understand, possibly understands, but then the politics take over, that unless everybody comes to a certain level of life, trafficking will continue to persist, because if there is inequalities present, people will be vulnerable. Some statistics in terms of 2025 update. I picked up this statistics from International Mission, GAPE International Mission. 27.6 million forced labor, labor exploitation 17.3 million, commercial sex exploitation 6.3. And again, these are, they would have made certain models to figure this out. What is the actual? We do not know. State imposed forced labor 3.9 million. Forced prison labor, compulsory participation in public work, or forced military conscription is also state imposed forced labor. So it is how you define and how do you look. Forced marriage, 22 million. People in situation of forced marriage unable to leave due to threats, coercion, and lack of legal recognition. 68% of these are women and girls. So girls from vulnerable families forced to marry men much older their age. %71% of all modern slavery victims, because women and girls and children are most vulnerable. Children approximately 25% of modern slavery, because they are most vulnerable. Multiple forms of exploration, different organization trapped, different extraction issue. ILO estimates 49.6 million people trapped in modern slavery. Forced labor cases. So again, different reports, different sources, different statistics. One thing common, there's a big problem, and the global community is not giving enough focus onto it. Reputable source. So there are 5 reputable sources for trafficking information in case you want to look at it. ILO gives facts and figures. Trafficking in persons report released by, I don't know whether this now, with the current state of the US government and their focus on cutting down federal employees and cutting down regulators, will carry on. How will US respond in terms of trafficking? What will happen, because now we have entered a very gray area in terms of US and its role as a global monitor. UNODC is a reputable source, Polaris is a reputable source, and Walk Free Foundation publishes the Global Slavery Index, offering country by country insight into modern slavery. So these are 5 sources one can bookmark or look at in case you're looking at trafficking. In India, persons 2024 trafficking in persons report of the US State Department, which says government of India does not fully meet the minimum standards for elimination of trafficking, but is making significant efforts. Overall increased efforts compared to previous reporting periods. India remained on tier 2. 28 states and 8 union to investigate. So now you see how difficult it is. You have a law, then it has to go down. There are people involved. There are agencies involved. There is coordination involved. There is information sharing involved. There is politics involved. Especially against bonded laborers remains inadequate compared to the scale of the problem. And it's not that a state government or a central government is focusing on this problem. There are thousands of problems one has to look at. There were no specialized courts to hear trafficking cases. If the judge does not understand trafficking or is not sensitized to a trafficking victim, the case gets thrown out. Not adequately trained on trafficking result in drawn out trials. "29 states operated 412 courts for POSCO. However, judges and prosecutors sometimes lack training expertise in POSCO crimes." There was this case of Karnataka where a very big politician was accused of POSCO. Under POSCO law, any person accused of POSCO is immediately arrested. But that person was given a free pass, saying that he's a big political heavyweight. Now, when this happens, the messages go out very clearly. There is an establishment of anti-human trafficking unit in several states. According to Walk Free, their impact has been limited. Again, as I said, if you pick up the media, newspapers, or see TV news, what is the percentage which is devoted to trafficking in terms of trafficking news, in terms of trafficking detected, in terms of trafficking problem? Founder of NGO Pravaha points to societal indifference, underfunded police work, lack of support for victim behind this poor outcome. So hotspots like West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, only 198 trafficking cases led to conviction the past decade, according to Fair Plan. It's a huge problem. It's a complex problem. Resources need to be given, personnel needs to be given, and so on and so forth. Efforts to prevent human trafficking continue to lead government anti-trafficking effort. Absence of national coordination mechanism. And again, as I said, what is the coordinating? How coordinating mechanism? How is the information shared? What is the sensitization? What is the overall consistency? And so on and so forth. This is the US State Department report. This is a news item from the Hindu, January 24. So if you Google and say trafficking news from India, see how many news comes out. See how many you are able to get hits. Only 1,031 convictions between 2018 and 22. So there is this global report on trafficking in person 2024. You can download this country data, South Asia. In fact, I picked up the data from this report. This is India data. Purpose of trafficking. And if you see, continuously it is increasing. 2024, it came down because of the pandemic. 6,693 total persons. And look at the citizenship of the detected victims. Majority of them were Indians. So internal trafficking is extremely high. Okay, let's sum up. Enactment of international national aimed at tackling the problem, tackling a continuous menace of trafficking continue to pose a substantial danger, prevalence of trafficking data at both global and national levels, violation of victims' fundamental rights. Different types include forced labor, sex trafficking, child trafficking, organ. In terms of organ trafficking, patients in the US who needs organs are then matched with prisoners in detention camps in China. And once these prisoners are executed, their organs are removed by the prison guards and trafficked to the US where they are sold. Look at the kind of profits these criminal gangs would be making. So everything is mapped onto everything else. And now with internet, this information is very easily shared between entities, between various criminal gangs. Various factors that contribute to poverty, lack of education, weak legal system. There are some references in the unit. In case you have not received the unit, all the units are available at eGyan Kosh. You can download them. Okay. Any questions? Hi, guys. I hope I didn't go too fast. The units, in fact, many units in MDI 9 have been written by me. So, yeah, Sanjeev.
Sir, why we call trafficking in persons? Why not we call trafficking of persons? It's a grammatical, I think so.
No, trafficking in persons, because you are persons are looked as a product. Trafficking, trafficking in let's say heroin. So trafficking in person. So the person has become a unit. I guess that's the reason they are talking about trafficking in persons.
Sir.
But let me find out more why of trafficking of persons. In persons makes more sense than off. let me read more and
Yes,
tell you.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Any other question? Can HT be considered as a part of forced migration? In a way, yes, Vinod, absolutely. Once you are coercing a person who has been trafficked to move from one place to another, that's forced migration. Why don't I look at right now and see? Sanjeev, why don't you Google and say why is it trafficking in person? Why is it trafficking in person and not of person? Trafficking in person refers to the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving individuals. So there are multiple. That's why I say in person. Is used to emphasize the movement and manipulation of human beings for exploit. As I said, a human being has become a commodity. That's why in persons.
Okay.
Sanjeev?
Sir.
The phrase in person is used to emphasize the movement and manipulation of human beings for exploitative persons rather than the trafficking of objects or goods. That is why trafficking in person. So I was right.
Sir, another doubt.
Tell me.
Sir, we studied about Philippine diaspora where women are more in number in migration than men, and their remittances part is also more in comparison, right? And Filipino diaspora, I mean, women are more in caring industry.
Right? That's right.
Yeah. Then, sir, if we talk about caring industry, it can be, I mean, I mean, up to some level, we can say that it can also be considered as forced. Maybe.
Okay. Now, Sanjeev, so Sanjeev, the essential difference is difference between a person as offering its labor for offering its services or labor for services and forced labor is the fact, does the person has the right to leave that employment? Does the person receive a remuneration for the work done? Does the person has right to move out of the place of work? If these things are not happening, then it is forced and it's under trafficking.
Okay.
So at the end of the day, a domestic worker, so you have a domestic worker in your house, the domestic worker has the right to refuse a particular work. The domestic worker gets a remuneration or a salary in lieu of the domestic work. The domestic worker is free to come and go based on the timing set. That is a valid work.
Sir.
If the domestic worker has no such right, cannot leave the house, always has somebody accompanying the person, is forced, it does not get a salary, does not get a proper living accommodation or food to eat, is coerced and threats of force or sex, sexual exploitation, then that's a trafficking situation. Sajeev?
Okay, sir. So, sir, trafficking can happen even after migration, sir.
Oh, obviously. So if there's a risky migration and the migration is, kind of, let's say it's a forced migration. Look at Rohingyas. It was a forced migration.
Yes.
Now the fact is they are under risk. They are extremely vulnerable. Now, let's say there is a domestic compulsion or domestic politics in Bangladesh or India, and these people have no choice but to move into these countries. Obviously, they can be exploited. There could be criminals who could take advantage of them and traffic them.
Sir, even if that migration is not forced, also that forced labor can.
There is absolutely. So, for example, these women from Punjab were taken for a specific work, domestic or otherwise, in the Gulf state.
Yes.
It appeared to be a proper case of migrating for work to the Gulf. When they went out there, their passports were taken and they realized they were actually trafficked.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Vinod says, are we covering any focus modules on forced migration? Just curious. Vinod, the way these modules, there are 12 units. There are various aspects of human trafficking which is done. I will go through how culture and gender also contributes in terms of forced migration or trafficking. So we will cover vulnerabilities, we will cover signs. In fact, a lot of units of MDA9 have been written by me only. So we will cover that, and anything which is not covered or is not a part of the unit can be discussed during the classroom. Vinod? Okay. Any other question? Okay. In case there is no other question, I will take leave. Have a nice evening. Have a wonderful week ahead, and we will see each other next Saturday for MDI 7.